The morning my daughter-in-law called to tell me I was expected to host Thanksgiving for 23 people. I was standing in my kitchen in slippers, watching the bird feeder outside the window. A chickadee was eating alone. I remember thinking how peaceful that looked. I didn't say much on the phone. I never did. That was the thing about me that my son had apparently mistaken for agreement his entire adult life. I am 67 years old. I spent 41 years being the kind of woman who made everything easy for everyone else. Not because I was weak. I want to be clear about that. I did it because I believed, genuinely believed, that love meant removing friction from the people you loved. That belief cost me more than I can calculate. My name is not important. What I was, professionally, for most of my working life is not something my son ever cared to know. He knew I made quilts. He knew I watched Jeopardy. He knew I kept the same phone for 4 years longer than anyone thought reasonable. What he did not know, what neither he nor his wife, nor their carefully curated social circle ever bothered to ask, was that I had spent 22 years building something real, something that had my fingerprints on every wall of it. But I am getting ahead of myself. My husband passed in 2019. Stomach cancer. We had 38 years together, and I would take every hard one of them back without a second of hesitation. After he died, I did what women like me are expected to do. I stayed available. I stayed useful. I showed up to birthday parties and school plays and neighborhood barbecues, where I stood beside a cooler, holding a plate of deviled eggs, smiling at people I barely knew because my son thought it was important that I stay connected. My son's name is Preston. He is 41 years old. He married a woman named Lee when he was 32, and she is the kind of person who uses the word curate to describe how she arranges throw pillows. I do not say that to be cruel. I say it because it is true, and because this story only makes sense if you understand who these people are and what they valued and what, specifically, they never once thought to ask me. Preston and Lee have a nice house in Scottsdale. 4 bedrooms, a pool, the kind of kitchen where the appliances match and nothing looks like it has ever been used to make an actual meal. They have 2 children, my grandchildren, who I love more than the air in my lungs. Milo is 8. Charlotte is 5. They are the reason I kept showing up even when showing up started to feel like slowly disappearing. Every major holiday for 6 years, Thanksgiving included, had a version of the same choreography. Preston would call, usually a week before, sometimes less. He would describe what he and Lee were planning. The description always included how many people were coming, what the menu was going to look like, and what I was expected to contribute, financially, logistically, or both. The framing was never a question. It was a briefing. One year I paid for the catering because Lee had decided she wanted a real spread, and their budget was tight. One year I drove 4 hours to babysit for 3 days so they could focus on the preparation. One year I paid to have their backyard professionally decorated because Preston said the kids would love it, and I agreed that the kids would love it, and that was apparently all the justification needed. I never said no. Not once in 6 years. I want you to understand something. I was not a passive woman. I had opinions. I had a voice. I used both of them every day for most of my life in rooms where it mattered. But with Preston, with my own son, I had developed a habit of smallness that I did not fully recognize until very late. And by then, the habit had calcified into something that looked, from the outside, like personality. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday in October. Lee was the one who called, which was itself a kind of signal. When Preston had something he thought might be received badly, he sent Lee. She was smoother than he was. She knew how to say things sideways. She called to tell me that they were thinking about doing Thanksgiving big this year. Extended family, a few friends, the neighbors with the little boy Milo liked. She said the number was somewhere around 23, maybe a little more depending on RSVPs. She said the venue, and yes, she used the word venue, was going to be the private dining room at the Westin, which was a hotel restaurant in Scottsdale that I had driven past exactly once and which had, as I recalled, a valet stand and a menu printed on heavy cardstock. She said they were thinking family dinner, not potluck, because they wanted it to feel elevated. Then she paused. Then she said, "We were hoping you might be able to help cover it." I was quiet for a moment. The chickadee had left the feeder. A second one had taken its place. I asked her what help cover it meant. She said Preston had gotten some unexpected expenses this fall. She said they were stretched a little thin. She said it would mean so much to the kids to have a real Thanksgiving, not a scaled-back one. She said she knew I understood. I told her I'd think about it. That was not a lie. I did think about it. I thought about it for the next 4 days nearly constantly. I thought about the 6 years of scaled-down versions of myself I had handed over without complaint. I thought about the year I missed a reunion with my college roommate because Preston needed me to drive Milo to a birthday party. I thought about the money, which was not nothing. A private dining room at a hotel restaurant for 23 people, with the menu they were imagining, would be somewhere between $4,000 and $6,000. I want to stop here and say something, because I've heard people ask the question. I heard it even before this story was finished, the way you can feel a question forming in a room. Why did you keep paying? Why did you let it go on so long? The honest answer is that I did not understand, for a very long time, what I was actually paying for. I thought I was paying for connection. I thought the money was building something. I thought each check, each trip, each rearranged weekend was a deposit into a relationship that would eventually pay some kind of return. Not in dollars, but in the ordinary warmth of being known, being seen, being someone to my son that was more than a resource in his life's logistics. I was wrong, but I didn't know that yet. Or rather, I knew it and kept not knowing it, the way you can sit across from a truth for years and keep reaching past it for the salt. On the 5th day after Lee's call, I drove to a neighborhood in Phoenix that I had not visited in several years. I parked across the street and sat in my car. The building was still there. Of course it was. Brick facade, wide front windows, the kind of front door that opens heavy and closes quiet. Above the door, in the same brushed bronze lettering I had chosen myself in 2003, were the words, Hargrove and Associates. My name is Vivienne Hargrove. For 22 years, I ran an interior design firm in the Phoenix metro area. Not a boutique, not a one-woman operation out of a spare bedroom. A firm. At our peak, we had 16 full-time staff, 3 satellite offices, and contracts with hospitality clients from Scottsdale to Sedona to a resort property outside Tucson that had been written up in Architectural Digest in 2014. We designed restaurants, hotel lobbies, corporate offices, private residences. We designed, as it happens, the private dining room at the Westin. I sold the firm in 2021. 2 years after my husband died, when the grief had settled from a wave into a permanent weather pattern, I decided I was done. I sold to a partnership that included 2 of my longest tenured employees, people I trusted, people who deserved what I gave them. I walked away with enough money to live comfortably without ever worrying about it again. I set up trusts for both my grandchildren's education. I paid off the small mortgage remaining on my house in one afternoon, sitting at a closing table with a check I wrote from a chair I had upholstered myself. Preston knew I had sold the firm. He knew I had done well. He did not know the scope of what I had built because Preston had never, not once in 22 years, asked me a single substantive question about my work. He knew I did design stuff. He knew I was sometimes busy and sometimes traveled for projects. He knew, in the way you know things you have never examined, that I was fine and would continue to be fine, and that the specifics were not his concern. He certainly did not know that I had designed the Westin's private dining room. I sat in my car for a long time, looking at the building with my name on it, the name that would come off eventually when the new partners rebranded, which they had told me they planned to do. I thought about what Lee had said. Elevated. She had wanted something elevated. I smiled at that, there in my car alone. Then I picked up my phone and did something I had been considering for almost 8 months. I booked a flight to Lisbon. Not because I had always dreamed of Lisbon, though it was beautiful in the photographs. Because a woman I had known since graduate school, my oldest friend, the one I had canceled on 3 years earlier for the birthday party drive, had moved there after her own divorce and had been asking me to visit for 2 years. Every few months, she would send me a photograph. Cobblestones, yellow trams, pastéis de nata on a white plate at a table overlooking a red-roofed city. "Come see me," she would write. "I have a guest room and a good bottle of wine and know where we have to be." I booked the flight for Thanksgiving week. I booked it for 11 days. Then I called my travel agent, an actual travel agent, one I had worked with for 20 years on business trips, a practical and unflappable woman named Dottie, who had never once shown surprise at anything I asked her to arrange. And I told her I needed a few other things sorted as well. I did not call Preston. I did not call Lee. I spent the next 3 weeks doing what I had always done, which was to move through my days quietly. I watered my plants. I finished a quilt I had started the previous spring, a wedding gift for a neighbor's daughter, blues and creams in a log cabin pattern. I took Milo to the Science Museum when Preston and Lee had a conflict one Saturday afternoon. I held Charlotte in my lap and read her the same picture book 4 times in a row because she wanted to, and because I wanted to, and because those were the hours I planned to remember. On the morning of November 23rd, I was up before 5. I had packed the night before. 1 suitcase, medium-sized, sensible shoes and a few good pieces, the kind of wardrobe that travels well and doesn't declare too much. The pearl earrings my husband gave me for our 35th anniversary were already in the inside pocket of my bag. I had arranged for a car service through Dottie. The driver arrived at 5:40. I locked my house, which has a combination lock I installed 3 years ago because I kept losing keys, and I walked down my front path, carrying my own bag because I have always carried my own bag. It was still dark. The neighborhood was quiet. There was a neighbor's dog somewhere behind a fence that made a brief sound and then went still. I got into the car and we drove to the airport. Preston called at 11:30 in the morning, Phoenix time. I was somewhere over the Atlantic, or close enough. I had turned my phone to Do Not Disturb before boarding and had slept through the first 5 hours of the flight, which I never managed to do on planes, so either the universe was generous or I was more tired than I had admitted to myself. When I turned my phone back on over international waters, I had 11 messages. 3 from Preston, 2 from Lee, 1 from Preston's older sister, my daughter Ramona, who lives in Portland and was, I would learn later, not in on any of this, asking if I was okay because Preston had called her in a panic. 1 from a number I didn't recognize, which turned out to be the event coordinator at the Westin, who had been given my name as the billing contact for the Thanksgiving reservation. That was the detail that clarified everything for me. Reading it at 30-some thousand feet with a plastic cup of orange juice on the tray table. I was the billing contact. They had made a reservation for 23 people at a hotel restaurant, given the hotel my name as responsible for the bill, and not mentioned any of this to me. Preston's first message was cheerful. A run-through of the plan, who was coming, what time the reservation was. No question, no ask, a briefing. His second message was still cheerful, but with an edge. They were heading to the restaurant soon, and he hadn't heard back from me. He hoped I was getting his messages. His third message was not cheerful. "Mom, where are you?" Lee says the hotel called her back because the billing contact number wasn't working. "Are you on your way? We're all at the table. Everyone's here. Please call me back." I read the messages in the order they came. Then I read them again. Then I set my phone face down on the tray table and looked out the window at the clouds below, which were flat and white and stretched in every direction farther than I could see. I am not a woman who cries easily. I did not cry then. What I felt was not grief exactly. It was something more like the sensation of setting down something very heavy that you have been carrying so long, you stopped noticing the weight. I composed a text to Preston. I did not write it in anger. I have never made good decisions in anger, and this was not a decision made in anger. It was a decision made in 3 weeks of quiet and 41 years of accumulated information. I wrote, "Preston, I'm sorry I missed your calls. I'm on a flight to Portugal. I had made plans I should have told you about earlier, and I take responsibility for that. But I want to be honest with you. The reservation was made without my agreement. My name was given to the hotel without my knowledge, and the expectation that I would pay was not a conversation we had. It was a conclusion, that was reached for me. I love you. I love Lee. I love those babies more than I can say. But I can't keep being the answer to a question no one has thought to ask me. Have a wonderful Thanksgiving. I mean that. I'll be in touch when I land. I turned my phone off again. My friend's name is Suzanne. She was waiting at the arrivals hall in Lisbon with a handwritten sign that said Hargrave on it, like a driver, and when I walked through the doors and saw her standing there with that cardboard sign and her silver hair and the same coat she'd had since 2015, I laughed for the first time in longer than I could remember. She drove me back to her apartment in a small Fiat that rattled over cobblestones and smelled like coffee and something floral I didn't recognize. The city came at me in pieces through the windows, hills, laundry on lines, an old man walking a very small dog, a yellow tram turning a corner with unhurried certainty. We sat on her terrace that night and ate soup she had made and drank the wine she had promised, a Portuguese red from a region I hadn't heard of, poured into mismatched glasses on a table she had set with cloth napkins and a single candle. We talked for 4 hours, not about Preston, not about any of it. We talked about graduate school, and the professor who thought neither of us had any future in design, and the apartment we had shared for 1 semester, where the radiator only worked if you hit it with a specific book. We talked about her life in Lisbon, the market she walked to on Saturday mornings, the class she was taking in hand-painted tile techniques, the neighbors who left tomatoes on her doorstep in summer. At some point, she asked me what I had left behind. I thought about it for a long moment. Not as much as they think, I told her. She nodded like that made complete sense. Ramona called the next morning, my daughter. She has her father's voice, low and unhurried, the kind of voice that never seems to be performing anything. She had heard the whole story from Preston by then, or his version of it. She said, "Mom, good for you. I mean it. Good for you." She asked if I was safe, if I was comfortable, if I had everything I needed. I told her I was drinking coffee on a terrace overlooking a city I had never seen before and that yes, I had everything I needed. She laughed. She said she was sorry she hadn't called sooner. She said she'd had no idea about the Thanksgiving plan, which I believed completely. Ramona had never been like Preston in that particular way. She understood instinctively that I was a person and not a resource, and I have thought about why that is. Whether it's birth order or temperament or something I did differently, and I still don't know the answer. She said, "Did you know that Preston had given your name to the hotel?" I told her I found out at 30,000 feet. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "He's going to have to pay for it." I said, "I imagined so," she said, "and he's going to learn something from that." Preston called 3 days into the trip, not angry. I think the anger had burned through in the first 24 hours, and what was left was something more uncomfortable. The kind of feeling you get when you realize you've been behaving badly for a long time, and everyone around you noticed, except you. He apologized. It was not a perfect apology. It referenced his stress and the timing, and how he'd assumed I was on board, based on how previous years had gone. But it was honest enough. He said he didn't realize how much he'd been leaning on me. He said Lee had said something to him, which surprised me, and still does, about how they had treated my time and my money like a given. I told him I appreciated him saying that. I meant it. I told him that going forward I would like to be asked, not briefed. I told him that I was not a logistics solution. I told him that I loved him and that I would very much like to have a relationship with him and with his family that did not require me to be less than I am. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Who designed Weston, Mom?" I smiled. I told him I would send him some photographs when I got home. What he did not know, what I had not yet told him, what I had asked Dottie to arrange for me before I left, was that I had made a small reservation of my own. A private room back home in Phoenix for dinner in mid-December. 6 people only. Preston, Lee, Ramona and her husband, and Milo and Charlotte. A room in a restaurant I had designed 20 years ago, in a building whose light I had planned myself down to the placement of each fixture, whose acoustics I had consulted on, whose tablecloths were a color I had specified in a document that still existed somewhere in a filing cabinet that now belonged to someone else. The restaurant was called the Hargrove Room. It had been named for me in 2006 by a client who said he wanted the room to carry the name of the person who had understood what he was trying to build before he could articulate it himself. It had been called that for 18 years. It was in a publication. I could have shown my son any time he had thought to ask. The reservation was for 6:30 on a Saturday. I had arranged for the children to have a small separate course. Something simple, pasta, the kind Milo liked, and for the adults to have the full-tasting menu, which was exceptional, which I knew from the 3 times I had eaten there in a professional capacity and the 2 times I had eaten there alone. I paid for it myself. This was not a lesson about money. It was never about money. I flew home on December 2nd. Suzanne drove me to the airport at 5 in the morning, and we stood in the departures lane in the dark, and she held my face in her hands, the way you do with someone you've known long enough that the gesture doesn't require explanation. "Come back," she said. "I will," I told her, and I meant it. I was already thinking about spring, about the tile class she had mentioned, about the terrace and the mismatched glasses and the city that had existed entirely without my knowledge for centuries and had not suffered at all for it. December was cold in Phoenix, which is relative. 50s at night, 60s in the day, the mountains going slightly blue in the late afternoon. I decorated my house simply that year, a wreath, some candles, a small tree with the ornaments my husband and I had collected, which I took out of their tissue paper one by one and held for a moment before I hung them. On the evening of the dinner, I arrived at the restaurant early. I stood in the entrance of the Hargrove Room for a moment before anyone else arrived. The light was exactly as I had intended it, warm, not orange. The kind of light that makes a face look like itself, not a performance of itself. The wall treatment was a deep sage that had taken me 4 rounds of samples to get right. The chairs were upholstered in a fabric I had sourced from a mill in North Carolina that was still in business, still making the same cloth. My name was on the placard by the door. It had always been on the placard by the door. I had walked past it exactly twice before tonight without stopping. Tonight I stopped. Preston arrived 7 minutes later with Charlotte on his hip, and Milo pushing in front of him already talking about something he'd seen on the way in. Lee was behind them. She looked at the sign and then she looked at me and she started to say something and then she stopped. Preston read the placard. He read it twice. He looked at me. I let him look. Milo said, "Grandma, your name is on the door." I told him yes, it was. He said, "Is this your restaurant?" I told him it wasn't. Exactly. I told him I had designed it. I told him that designing something meant you decided how the light would fall and what colors the walls would be and what it would feel like to sit inside it. I told him that I had done that for a long time before he was born, for lots of rooms, including this one. He thought about this very seriously. He said, "So you made it nice?" I told him that was exactly right. Charlotte wanted to know if there was pasta. We went inside. Dinner was 3 hours long, and no one looked at their phone. Ramona's husband told a story about a disastrous camping trip that made Charlotte laugh so hard she had hiccups. Preston asked me questions, real ones, not the polite kind, about the design work. He asked about the Westin. He asked how long the dining room had taken. He asked if I had other rooms in the city, which I did, and I told him about them, and he listened. Lee asked if I would show her some of the portfolio sometime. I told her I would like that. At one point during dessert, Preston put his hand over mine on the table. He didn't say anything. I didn't need him to. I will not pretend that evening fixed everything. Relationships built on 40 years of accumulated misunderstanding don't resolve themselves over a tasting menu. But things shifted that night in ways that I could measure in the weeks that followed. The calls were different. The questions were different. There was a humility in Preston that had not been there before, or that had been there and buried under layers of assumption and convenience, and which was now, slowly, finding its way to the surface. Milo drew me a picture in January. He does that sometimes. Cuts a piece of paper from his sketchbook and puts it in an envelope and mails it to me, because I once mentioned that I liked getting real mail. The picture was of a building with a big door and a woman standing in front of it. He had written underneath in his second-grade handwriting, My grandma made this nice. I have it on my refrigerator. Right next to the photograph Suzanne sent me from Lisbon. Her terrace in early morning light, 2 coffee cups on the table, the city in the background doing what cities do, continuing without apology, going on. I look at it every morning when I pour my coffee black, no sugar. I think there is still time. I think I know exactly who I am.